Hi again, my sisters and brothers, and welcome to our third week looking at the wonderful biblical idea of amazing grace. In the first week, we reflected on the character of God Himself as being centered in grace. And in the second week, we considered how God's grace towards us is ultimately expressed in the death of Jesus in place of sinners as a sacrifice of atonement. This week we shift a bit and we start to think about the transforming effect of grace in the lives of those who know that their sins have been forgiven. By the power of the Holy Spirit, God's grace towards you can make a normal, self-centered person like you into someone whose life is characterized by an abiding sense of gratitude and humility. God's grace can make a normal person like you someone who can actually rejoice when good things happen to other people, even other people whom you don't like. God's grace can turn you into someone who is wonderfully generous as you grow in your understanding that you have received far more than in 100 lifetimes you could ever give. But the way that God's grace does this is by shaking up and undermining our understanding of God and of ourselves. Think about this. Imagine that you're having a chaotic day, you're running late, you have to go to the supermarket to pick up a few groceries. You're very flustered. You race around, the last thing you need is shampoo. You get to the shampoo aisle and there's this woman there right in front of the shelf you need. She's dithering and wasting time and indecisive, and because of COVID, you don't want to get into her space. You're very exasperated and eventually she drifts aside. You reach in, you grab the shampoo, you zoom to the checkout. There are 2 queues. You do some quick maths and join the shorter of the 2. To your intense frustration, the shorter of the 2 queues is moving more slowly than the longer of the 2 queues. And after you've been queuing for about 4 minutes and are just about to reach the checkout, the woman who held you up in the shampoo aisle joins the long queue and reaches the checkout at the same time as you do. Now, here's my question. Why do you feel a sense of resentment towards her? Why do you begrudge her the fact that you and she both arrive in the car park at the same time? What's going on in our hearts in that moment? Well, bear that in mind as we look at today's Bible reading, which is a parable that Jesus told, which we have recorded for us in Matthew chapter 20. Jesus said, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, 'You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' So they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, 'Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?' 'Because no one has hired us,' they answered. He said to them, 'You also go and work in my vineyard.' When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, 'Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first.' The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came, and each received a denarius. So, when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." But he answered them, "I'm not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So, the last will be first, and the first will be last. In this parable, Jesus sets up a completely normal, everyday village scene in the rural economy of his day. You have landowners and business owners, and when they have a need for labour, they go to the marketplace. And there are people who make their living as day workers. They hire themselves out 1 day at a time, and at the end of the day, the normal pay was a denarius. The story continues, and in this particular case, we hear that this landowner who owns a vineyard goes out not just once at the start of the day to get his workforce, but again and again, multiple times throughout the day, going back for more labour. And this means that at the end of the day, at knock-off time, there's a group of workers there who are a mix. Some are 11th hour hires. They've only worked for 1 hour. They've barely had time to raise a sweat. And there are others there who've been working since breakfast. And in Jesus' story, here's where things get interesting. We heard in verse 9, the workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. So when those who came were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. What's happening? What's happening inside you as you hear that story? How does it sit? Perhaps it takes you back to the supermarket and the 2 queues at the checkout. See, we put together a world in which we're entitled to certain things, and which, by those same rules, others are not entitled to certain things. And because we do that, we develop the capacity to construe other people's fortune as if in some perverse way it's our misfortune, even though they're getting the same. We feel as though we deserve to leave the supermarket ahead of that annoying woman, not at the same time. And in the same way in Jesus' parable, those who worked all day, even though they were paid what they were entitled to, feel like they ought not to receive the same as those who showed up with 1 hour to go. Jesus says their response was to grumble in verse 12. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. Did you notice, fascinatingly, what their key complaint is? They say to the landowner, "You have made them equal." The owner says, "You receive everything you deserve, and because of generosity, it's true, I'm making others equal to you." Where's the injustice in that? He says, "I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I'm generous?" What a question. This parable is not our normal go-to passage when we're trying to understand the message of God's grace to us. Philip Yancey says, grace is unfair, which is one of the hardest things about it. And he has this parable in mind when he says that. It's the unreasonableness of the landowner's generosity. It's why I've titled this message, The Scandal of Grace. There's something not quite right about it. But what does the parable mean? Well, interestingly, Bible commentators really do puzzle over this. Some suggest those who work from the start of the day are God's Old Testament people, the Jews, and those who arrive at the 11th hour are Jesus' followers, but they're all in the vineyard together. Some others say, based on the context, no, those who start at the start of the day are Jesus' disciples who are with him from the very start, and those who arrive at the 11th hour are later Christians, but they're all in the vineyard together. Some say the working day in this parable represents all of the history of the world counting down to the return of the Lord Jesus. There are those who put their trust in God early and others late. Some think the working day is a human life, so that some people are Christians all their life, others become Christians at the very end, like the man who was crucified alongside Jesus and who said, "Remember me." The punchline that Jesus gives in verse 16 is, the last will be first and the first will be last. What does he mean by this? Well, in this case, he's not suggesting that some people will miss out or be punished. Everyone in this parable is in the vineyard, and everyone in this parable gets a payout. And so, on this occasion, this is not Jesus responding to his enemies or his critics. This is a parable which is intended to expose the hearts of those like us who are in the vineyard, but don't fully see the implications of God's grace towards us. The parable subtly invites us to empathise with the all-day workers as the inverse order of people's pay builds up to that punchline. And because we do that, it does leave an oddly sour taste. Our hearts generate this hierarchy of entitlement which we think should govern all human reality. The last thing that we want in such circumstances is equality. Well, as a puzzling parable, what does it mean? Or maybe more to the point, how does the gospel of God's grace to us in the cross of Jesus address the concerns that this parable raises? Well, the very next verse in the Gospel of Matthew takes us straight to the cross. So if we were to read on, chapter 20, verse 17 says, "Now Jesus was going up to Jerusalem. On the way, he took the 12 aside and said to them, 'We are going to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests, the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death, and on the third day he will be raised to life.'" Now, where does that fit in the world of the parable? The scandal of grace is that it makes unequal things equal. It makes the 11th hour workers equal to the all-day workers. But before it does that, the true scandal is that it makes Jesus, the perfect Son of God, equal to a small-minded and resentful person like me. That's the scandalous equality that grace creates when Jesus goes to the cross for sinners. At the foot of the cross, seeing Jesus crucified for us, that's where we really understand both grace and equality. Standing at the foot of the cross, we don't look at others around us and say, "I got here before you." All that really matters is that Jesus got here before any of us. In God's scandalous grace, a repentant sinner is made equal to the risen Son of God and invited into the kingdom. This equality is what all our hopes depend on. It's what Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, when he says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. You see, we're entitled to nothing, but we receive everything. Well, how shall we apply this to our own thinking? Let me take you back to the parable. Where does grace begin in this parable? This dawned on me in a new way as I reflected on this. The true moment of grace in this parable, the true moment at which the full reward is guaranteed, is not the end of the day when people queue up and receive their payout. The true moment of grace is the moment when the owner goes out to the marketplace and invites the unoccupied workers into his vineyard. The key to the parable is the grace of that vineyard owner going out again and again and again and seeking more and more workers who will come in and be paid in full. In verse 6 we heard, he went out again about noon, and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing? Because no one has hired us, they answered. He said to them, you also go and work in my vineyard. My sisters and brothers, that is God's grace to you. The point is not the time of day. The point is that you are unhired and unwanted. And in Jesus, his beloved Son, God has come into the marketplace and called you into his vineyard. From the moment you accept his gracious call, full payment is assured. Can I leave you with some questions to reflect on as we apply this word to our hearts? The first is for you, perhaps if you're uncertain of where you stand with Jesus, or maybe you can say clearly you wouldn't call yourself a Christian believer. Well, the message of this parable is that it is not too late. You can be included at the 11th hour. You ought not to think, I wasn't brought up that way. If that's you, I encourage you to reflect on whether this is the moment for you to accept the call of the vineyard owner into his vineyard. A second question for reflection. If you're someone who knows your own heart and you do find it easy to begrudge others the good things that go on in their lives, why don't you reflect on what exactly this parable has to say to you about God's grace and how it works in your heart? And a final question, this one about generosity. If you're someone who doesn't find it easy to be generous, I invite you to imagine that you are one of those hired at the 11th hour. When you put yourself into that mindset, how does that affect the way that you think about the things that God has entrusted to you in your life? May God bless us as we consider these things together.